discussion, assessment of President John Mahama's speech with Comrade Kwesi Pratt Jr., who will share with us his thoughts, the general secretary of the Socialist Movement of Ghana.
Well, this is one of the most brilliant speeches that I've ever heard delivered in the UN General Assembly meeting. Outstanding. You know, and the composture was also correct. So you would notice that after the speech, it's become a major item for discussion, not just in Ghana, but throughout Africa and in other parts of the world. Now, the distinguishing thing about this speech is that it was bold, you understand? It was very, very bold, because it took positions that other leaders are unable to take because of the fear of reprisal, of punishment, and so on, especially by the United States of America. Now, I think it's also important to understand that His Excellency John, excuse me, His Excellency John Dramani Mahama, it's okay now, is not just the President of Ghana. He's also what they call the AU champion on reparations. So now when he speaks in international fora, he speaks for Ghana and then he speaks for the AU as its champion on reparations. Now, one of the things that he said in this speech, which is most significant, is his stance that Israel would not be able to impose peace in the Middle East through war. And that the only way to do that is to ensure that the two-state solution is implemented. And the two-state solution envisages the establishment of an independent Palestinian state with full guarantees for its security. And he made that point. Now, that's a point that Western leaders are just beginning to realize, which has led to a flood of recognitions of the state of Palestine, you know. But he made that point, and he made it very, very strongly. He also made the point that the absence of President Mahmoud Abbas and his delegation must be exceedingly worrying for all leaders of the world, and that's a fact. You know, for the United Nations headquarters to be situated in New York, the US had to make guarantees that it would not impede participation in the UN's activities and so on. That pledge was trampled under the feet of Trump easily when it refused to allow President Mahmoud Abbas and his delegation into New York. You know, and there's some interesting history. Indeed, the excellent relations between Ghana and Cuba arises out of the treatment of President Fidel Castro, I think in 1959, when he went to address the United Nations General Assembly, and no hotel in New York was prepared to give him accommodation. And as a result, he and his delegation went to the Hotel Teresa. You know, he stayed in the Hotel Teresa, and Nkrumah visited him in the Hotel Teresa, and that began, you know, what has become an excellent relationship between Ghana and Cuba. So there have been all kinds of cases. In fact, there is one other precedent that the Trump administration is threatening to expel from New York because he took part in the pro-Palestinian demonstration in New York, which took place around, you know. But President Mahama's speech was undoubtedly a very significant speech, very powerful, very bold, and so on. Then he touched on the question of reparations. And I think reparation is one of the issues which is most misunderstood. Reparation is not asking for compensation. Reparation is not asking for money. Reparation is about resetting the world, and he made that point very clear in his speech. He said, we want to reset the world. And in fact, the first institution in the world which needs resetting is the United Nations. You know, at the time that the UN was established, there were only 3 African countries which were members of the UN. The UN was dominated largely by the colonial powers, you know, and the capitalist states and so on. So they structured the United Nations which sought to protect their interests and not the interests of the colonies then and so on. And the UN itself established institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, you know, the World Trade Organization and so on, without African participation. And this explains why, even though Africa has a population of 1.4 billion people, Africa has no voice on the UN Security Council. You know, so the agenda to reset, you know, the UN and its institutions is very, very important. Now, there are some who say that, oh, the slave trade happened so many years ago and so on, and perhaps we should forget it. The slave trade is continuing up to today. The slave trade continues up to today. What happened? The slave trade was an attempt by the Western capitalist states to accumulate surplus value, which then became the basis for its development. The extraction of surplus value continues. We are still the hewers of wood and drawers of water for the advanced capitalist states. You understand? So the main objective of the slave trade, which is the accumulation of surplus value, is continuing, and it has to stop somehow. Then come to think of it, the atrocities which were committed against the African people, the atrocities. And the world is compensating others who suffered less than the African people. You talk about the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bomb explosions. I mean, the victims have received reparation of some sort. You talk about the Holocaust against the Jews. The victims have received reparation of some sort. Why not the African people? Look, you go to Congo, and the whole of the Congo was the personal property of the Belgian king at the time. And that was the time that rubber had become so very important in the world. So this Belgian king, King Leopold, required the Congolese people to supply him with rubber. So everybody had a quota to supply. If you fail to supply your quota, they cut off one arm. The next time, if you fail to supply your quota, they cut the other arm. This is how Belgian colonialism operated in Africa. I mean, incredible cruelty. I mean, it was so atrocious and so on. And there are many other stories. There's a story which was told by President John Dramani Mahama himself. The story of the South African woman who had, pronounced backside, And these white guys came and saw this woman with this pronounced backside and decided to capture her as an animal and take her to Europe. So they actually put her in a glass cage and exhibited her, human being, for people to go and see. And then they jeered at her, they booed at her, they did all kinds of things to her. And this woman eventually committed suicide. I mean, can you imagine? Can you imagine? There is the case of the woman from Elmina, who had a cat, a cat scratch on her arm, and decided to apply African medicine. She was captured by the Portuguese. She was tried in the castle. The matter was referred to Portugal. She was tried in Portugal and convicted for witchcraft. Nobody knows what happened to the woman after today. This is a woman from Elmina. So, this is how they treated us. Look, the historical record, and it depends on how you do the calculation. In fact, those who take the records of the slave ships, the capacity of the ships to carry human beings, how many human beings are recorded to have been carried on the ship and so on, if they do that calculation, they come to the conclusion that 80 million people were shipped out of Africa. 80 million people were shipped out of Africa into slavery. 80 million. When can we recover from this? Other calculations indicate that 12.6 million people were shipped out of Africa. Even 1 million people. And the people who were shipped, they were not the old, they were not the sick, they were not the infirm and so on. They were the strongest, because which slave trader is going to carry sick people? They were the architects, they were the doctors and so on. They were shipped out of our continent. I think it's about time for us to examine the consequences of this on us today and to take measures to block the continued dehumanization of the African people and the exploitation of the African people. Today, many, if not all, French-speaking African countries, they have to deposit all of their foreign reserves in the Central Bank of France. And then they go to France to borrow money. In effect, what they are doing is that they are borrowing their own money and they are paying interest on their money. So reparation is not just for the transatlantic slave trade. It is for that. It's also for classical colonialism, and it's also for neo-colonialism. There is no institution in the West, viable institution in the West, whose wealth did not come from slavery. The church, take the church. The church was an active participant in the transatlantic slave trade. The Catholic Church was an active participant in the transatlantic slave trade and benefited tremendously. Today, the Catholic Church is one of the richest institutions in the world. How come? Because it profited from slavery. Okay? You take a bank like Barclays Bank. Barclays was established by the Barclay brothers. The Barclay brothers were slave traders. It is the money they made out of slavery which they invested in establishing that bank and so on. So take any Western institution. I think the time has come for justice for the African and the Caribbean people. The time has come for us as Ghanaians, as Africans, and as citizens of the world to demand justice for those who were wronged. And that is us and our brothers and sisters in the Caribbean. And I'm so happy that President John Dramani Mahama raised these issues before the world and insisted that we are not going to be beggars, but we are going to continue the struggle for restitution. We are going to continue the struggle for resetting the world, and we will continue the struggle for reparations for the African and Caribbean people. It was a brilliant speech. I mean, this is the type of speech that one used to hear from people like Robert Mugabe, from people like Kwame Nkrumah, from people like Sekou Touré, Modibo Keita, and Gaddafi. So he has joined the league of exceptional African leaders, and I think that we need to recognize that.
Thank you.